Helena.
Great, thank you. I'm going to put up the slides so that we can see those as we go. Excellent. Great. So thank you so much for joining us. As Aurelia said, the programme completed last year, and it's been wonderful actually to have the time to reflect on it, both with the charities that took part and with colleagues and with those who worked on it, in order to be able to really put together what I hope you'll find an interesting report, if you've not already had a chance to look at it, that really examines some of what it looks like as a funder to be supporting a smaller charity, and some of the things that we learned through that, which was an important part of this programme. So I've been at CAF Charities Aid Foundation for about, I think it's coming up close to 5 years now, and I came in at the kind of conception of this programme and worked on it through the whole life cycle. So I'm really happy to be here and really happy to answer some questions. So I'm going to kind of go through very briefly, I think, just sort of what the programme was, just kind of give you an overview of that and talk about some of the learning that came out, and look at some of the kind of barriers perhaps as to why charities don't get funded for resilience. And then I'm really happy to move into questions and see where the conversation takes us. So essentially, the programme's what you would call theory of change, or hypothesis in a sense, was that by having the time and the help to explore their resilience, that charities would be able to work out what resilience meant for them, because obviously every organisation is different and their strengths and weaknesses are different, so their journey would be different, and give them the time and space to be able to work on that with some help from external expertise. So within this programme, it was, as Aurelia mentioned, funded by philanthropists entirely, which can be quite unusual. The initial funder was a CAF client who had been giving for a number of years to smaller organisations, and through his own giving, he'd really noticed a bit of a trend that he would give organisations money for their programmes, and that would be great. But then a few years later, they would come back with needing help again, and often with the same sort of issues going on in the background, and the same sort of challenges. And he realised that until he started investing in those organisations a little bit, so they had a bit of time and space to address some of those problems, they would always be on a cliff edge. And through that kind of journey that he'd been on, he was very keen to look at, well, what could we do to encourage other people who give money to charities to think about funding the organisation? And the suggestion was, why don't we try doing a bit of a pilot programme? We'll take 10 smallish charities, sort of under 1 million, which for a charity is a relatively small space still. And we will work with those organisations to help them address their challenges, identify them first, address them, and be able to really improve where they are at as a charity, as an organisation. And then having done that, we'll look at whether or not that's made the difference and the impact that we were hoping for. So as was mentioned, it was 10 charities from across the UK, all of them working in quite different cause areas. So we had some that were more medical, some that were community centres, several that worked around poverty, several that worked with young people, various different things going on. But each of them felt that while they did great work on the ground, they really felt a sense of, as an organisation, we could be stronger, we could be better positioned, we could be in a space where we could do more, and we don't feel we have the time or the knowledge on how to address that. And so that's how we selected them. As organisations we could see some potential in, but we felt really needed some help around thinking about what their organisational resilience and strengths should look like. This was a 2-year programme for each of the charities that came on. We worked with them over 2 years each. And we've got at the bottom here, it was specifically resilience funding. So we were giving them money, and we were giving them help, and we were giving them access to experts to help them. But all of this was based around their actual resilience as an organisation. So we weren't giving them any money towards their day-to-day programmes. So for example, if they were a youth charity, none of the funding went to their direct delivery with young people. It all went on them as an organisation being able to sort of step back from the day-to-day and be able to really focus on them as an organisation. So the point of it, in a sense, was to have quite a short-term intervention, only 2 years, but where we created almost a kind of an eye of the storm, a kind of a window in the middle of all this busy activity of supporting the people that they were there to help, but to create a place of calm almost in the middle, where those who were at the top of the charity and wanted to do strategy and really wanted to be able to focus on the future, but very often just didn't have the time for it, were able to move into that space, spend less time on the day-to-day, have other people pick that up, and be able to really ask the big questions of, what are the things about our organisation that are really inefficient, and how can we fix those? What are the other ways of operating that we just haven't had time to consider, but we should? What are the most important things to our beneficiaries, the people that we help? What do they value most about our service? And is that what we're actually putting the most of our energies into? Are there better ways we could be delivering our mission? Are there other things we could be doing? Are there best practices that we just haven't picked up on because we've been so busy at the coalface, as it were, just delivering support to our community? And so that was what the programme essentially was, trying to create that window of time and space for reflection and for help for each organisation that came on. So in terms of the charities on the programme, they received 3 things, as I mentioned. They got a grant, so they received up to £50,000 a year each. And as I say, they couldn't spend that on their day-to-day work. They had to use it to free up their time. What that looked like for the majority of charities was staffing. I think 70-something% overall of the grants went onto staffing. Sometimes it was paying directly for a CEO. For example, we had several charities where the CEO was 4 days a week and wanted to go to 5, but they didn't have the funding, so we were able to pay for an extra day. Or perhaps the CEO was the only person in the organisation who wasn't doing direct delivery, and so actually they used the money to bring in more staff on the ground so that the chief exec would have more time to be able to think about other things. Some of them brought in fundraising support because that had been taking up a huge amount of their chief exec's time, all sorts of different things. But a lot of the grants were used for creating a little bit of space, a little bit of time for the organisation to be able to do those strategic things, as I mentioned, that they wanted to, but they just weren't finding the time to do with everything else that they had going on. You hear chief exec and you often imagine people who are making big decisions and thinking very strategically and organising from the top. When you are the chief exec of a small charity, you are quite likely to also be the main fundraiser, the main administrator, the person who is also responsible for looking after the building, all of the policies, liaising with the trustees. I'm sure many of you know from your own experiences of supporting small charities, or indeed perhaps being trustees, it can end up being a role where you wear so many hats that some of the most important ones just never seem to be the ones that you get to wear the most. The second element that the charities had in terms of support was advisory. So we worked with each organisation to identify their strengths and weaknesses. We put together 6 characteristics of resilience, a kind of a framework to help them think about their organisational strength, and worked with them to identify where are the things where we need help. Some of the things that the charities did on the programme was simply about them having extra time created so they could go away and do something they knew how to do, they'd just never been able to. So for example, some charities said we could do so much better reporting, so much better impact understanding if we were just able to have some time and space to be able to sort out our databases, tidy them up, clean them out, sort out some better reporting systems. And so they could do that on their own. But quite often then they would say, well, we know now that having done all of this really useful work, we need to get better at thinking about what do we capture and for whom, and how do we capture that in a way that we can then communicate it both to the audiences of our funders, to the local community, to other people that are interested in the work that we do. And actually we'd like some outside help for that. So that's just one example of where we would bring in an external expert, either from CAF or from elsewhere, depending on what they needed, to help them with the challenges that they actually felt they wanted someone to support them with. And the third element was the programme support, the kind of the wraparound. They had a nominated person, myself, who worked with them and walked with them on that journey. And my role was very much about both accountability and reflection. I had a monthly call with each organisation for up to an hour. We got them together a couple of times a year in a room together. And my role was about helping them go back to the roadmap we'd built with them at the beginning, saying, these are the things you said you wanted to address. These are the things you said you would do yourselves. these are the things you said you wanted help with. Where are you with these? We've broken them down into kind of quarterly milestones. Let's look at what you're doing. Let's keep this on the agenda. And so keeping them to task, almost on track with the things that they wanted to do, making sure that their busyness didn't get in the way, but also helping the organisations to reflect on what wasn't working and why wasn't it working, and what had they tried and they maybe need to try doing differently. How far had they come? Sometimes it was really helpful for the charities just to have an opportunity to be able to have someone say, yes, I understand that there's still all this to do, but 6 months ago you were telling me this and you're not in that space anymore, are you? And for them to have somebody else reflect back to them, actually, yeah, we are growing, we are moving, our culture is changing, our ways of working are different. So I suppose just before I go on to the kind of key messages that came out in the report, and then before we move on to an opportunity for conversation, I thought it might just be useful, again, to go back to resilience funding, the phrase that I was using. It may seem like a little bit of a, I don't know, a nice thing to say, resilience funding, well, that sounds very nice, but very woolly. But essentially, when we think about funding for charities, most of the time charities receive one of two types of funding. They receive programme costs, so money that, the classic thing when you see the advert on the television that says £5 will buy a mosquito net, for example, for a charity in this part of Africa, you're giving to programme costs. It's money that goes directly to the things on the delivery of their mission. And that's not always too difficult for charities to find. There are lots of funders will give that. The public are often quite happy to give to programme costs because they're quite tangible. We can see what it is that we're getting for our money. We have a sense of a thing, of having purchased something that will enable the charity, and most donors of all different types are quite comfortable with programme costs. Then kind of the next stage onto that is getting core costs. It's far more difficult for charities to raise money for their chief executive salary, despite the fact you actually do need somebody who is in charge and is looking at the organisation. It's very difficult to get funding for your finance manager if you're lucky enough to have a full-time person in that role. It's difficult to get people to pay for things like your insurance and your boiler and your rent, because that doesn't excite us in the same way, does it? When we give to charity, we often feel that we want to give and make a difference. And for many people, they just don't see the difference that that makes. So core costs can be quite challenging for charities to get hold of, although they are vital. And I've known organisations that have closed because despite the fact people are willing to give to their programme costs, without those core costs of the things that keep the wheels turning, they just aren't able to keep the lights on and keep functioning. So resilience funding is actually going a stage beyond that. To receive core funding for a charity is fantastic because, as I say, it enables them to run a back office, to be able to do the things that they need to do. But it doesn't give them any time to be able to step away from their current model and actually say, has the world moved on? Has the situation for the people we're helping changed? Do we need to be delivering differently to different people in a different way with a different model? Could we be more effective or more efficient if we did things in this way? Very few charities receive funding that enables them to actually have time to look at their resilience and invest in themselves. And that's what we were doing in this programme. That was the focus of it. So I just thought that might be a useful kind of definition to think of at the beginning. So the programme report, I'm expecting some of you probably have read it and some of you haven't had a chance to yet, but thought you'd come on the call and find out a little bit more. The key messages that I'm going to run through, and we won't have time to cover the report in great detail, but hopefully this will pick out some of the sort of interesting areas for you, are as follows. The charities wanted people to know that they want funding for their organisational strength and for their resilience. Actually, most charities that you come across that are in that kind of smaller space are quite conscious of the areas where they are not as strong as they could be. A number of charities that are under £1 million are perhaps they've grown quite organically, and as they've got funding for new projects and new programmes, which is great, they found that actually their back office, as it were, their infrastructure is starting to creak and perhaps isn't as well set up as they would want it to be. So small charities are generally really keen to be able to receive some funding, to look at their organisational strength, to be able to look forward into the future and do things now that will help them be in a good space for that. Charities would like to be funded for all aspects of their involvement in funding programmes, and this may well be less relevant to yourselves as individual donors and philanthropists, but certainly in the sort of trust and foundation grants world, a number of charities receive funding to deliver a programme, which is great, but then they don't receive the money for the extra costs of that. So where they may be required to do reporting on it, where they may need senior management time and attention, where the trustees will perhaps need to spend time and energy in it, they don't receive any of the funding that would enable them to do that. And so one of the things that we're really asking for as a result of this particular programme is that funders who give to programme costs actually pay what it costs for a charity to take part in doing that. Long-term relationships. Small charities really value long-term relationships and would really like to be funded over several years so that they can plan, so that they actually have a sense of where the funding is going and are capable of making kind of longer term decisions, and also getting to the root of things. Being able to know that you're getting funding for more than 1 year enables you often to be able to actually sort of dig up the covers and have a look at what's going underneath, because you know you've got some time and space to be able to address that. And also then they get to know how their funders want to be reported to, and it saves the time of finding new people to fund them all of the time. So I would really encourage you, and I'm sure a number of you do already, to where you find a small charity that you are particularly keen on and you like their work and you feel they're doing something valuable, to stick with them for a few years and support them over some time and let them know that that's your plan. We would really recommend showing confidence in small charities and creating an atmosphere of honesty. There can be a real challenge for charities who obviously want funding, they want the money, they want to be able to do great things with it, that if they tell you what doesn't work, or if they tell you what they're weaker at, that perhaps you won't want to fund them anymore. And certainly on this programme, we found that particularly at the beginning, where we were telling charities, we want to fund you for the things that don't work. And yet I was still doing interviews with charities where they were constantly sort of best foot forward, telling me everything that was great. And I was having to say, but I don't expect everything will be perfect. What isn't working so well? So as a funder, being really open to hearing what hasn't worked and being willing to create a kind of a conversation of honesty with charities that you have long-term relationship with is really valuable. Supporting executive leaders. This really came out. Smaller charities, often that key person, particularly where we're talking of a staff team, in a number of cases where it may be under 10 people, where it's a small team, that key person that sort of carries all the responsibility on their shoulders and is a very visible, very present leader is really key. And being able to give some funding towards their role so that they are able to be in a position where they can do their job well and support their team and have a little bit of space to breathe, let alone think, is really important. And that was something that came out time and time again in the programme, that the leaders of the charity were focused on that. The final three that we had here were recognising that resilience funding won't necessarily have an immediate visible impact. And this, I guess, is a bit of a challenge to those of us that give, that we like to see results. We like to be able to know what our money has paid for. When you fund charities for their resilience, you do see a difference, but nothing happens quickly. It takes time for organisations to move and change and adapt. And sometimes it almost looks more messy at the beginning, where they're trying different things out or where they're transitioning from one way of working to another. It requires funders who give this kind of funding to be able to sort of stick with them for the longer term and have that confidence that the organisation will make a big difference if they're given some time. Recognising that building partnerships takes time and therefore money. This is probably one, again, around grant funding, that a number of charities spoke about their desire to work in partnership and how they recognised they were a small organisation, they couldn't possibly do everything that the people they were serving needed. But they found that building partnerships, which is an obvious way forward, really does take time, and that they just weren't funded to have the time to be able to figure out who else in their area was working on certain issues, how could they signpost, how could they better communicate with them, how could they work together. And this was one of the things that they were really keen to do more of. And finally, where funders are giving in kind of larger amounts, it's really worth thinking about putting those charities together at times and letting them learn from each other. And that was something really special that came out of this programme, that by giving the charities the opportunity to meet with each other and to share on their own challenges, they really learned from one another and found that a really important part of the programme that built their confidence and their own networks. So finally, you probably will have seen following the report, as CAF, we've put out a bit of a challenge, I guess, a good kind of call to action following the work that we've done. There's three parts to this, and you'll see, first of all, we're calling on trustees within charities to create a resilience fund that is designated for that, some money that they put aside as a charity every year to make sure that they invest in themselves, that they're not always running on empty, they're not always running at 100% capacity, that actually they invest in themselves, whether that's training or outside support or just funding for the staff to be able to step back from the day job at times and be able to think and plan. The second area was for charity leaders and charity directors to respect that time. It can be so easy when you have people at your door every day that need help and you're leading an organisation, so easy to just focus on that, understandably, but to prioritise the long-term future of their charity as well, and to make sure that they're making some space to really address the challenges and the needs that there are. And then the third part is asking charity funders, so those that give to charities, to explicitly support charities in being able to put money aside. So whether that's called a resilience designated fund, or whether that's giving unrestricted funding, or whether that's giving it in a restricted way, but saying to the charity, what is it that you need to address as an organisation? What would help you deliver your mission better? What would you like some help with? Do you have a terrible IT system and that's something you need to look at? Do you need some time and space to be able to have your chief executive's role part funded so they're not always doing delivery? What would make a difference to you? And then giving funding to that thing that would help the organisation move forward and away from the space it's in currently. When we looked at all the different forms of support that small charities receive, when we looked at the number of days we thought that a charity should be spending on resilience and average salaries, etc., and I'm happy to go into a bit more detail if people really want to know how we got there, we concluded that if everyone who gives regular grants to charities, that gives money, gave around 15% of their funds towards charities being able to work on their resilience, then that would mean that charities will be able to generate the minimum of £7,000 a year that we thought they would need in order to be able to at least start. It wouldn't be the same as being on this programme. This was a very intensive, quite a special experience for these organisations, but it would mean that charities across the sector were able to have something a little bit like a reserve, but not. Obviously, reserves are kept for kind of rainy day crisis or for closing down. Reserves are a different kind of thing, but almost like a reserve for investing in yourselves as an organisation. I guess the final thing I would say before we move into conversation and kind of any reflections and thoughts that people had is that I'm really keen and really happy to see that there are a number of funders and donors who are moving from having a bit of a mentality of I will pay for the thing on the front line, I will pay for these specific things and nothing else, and then the charity has to figure out how they run, how they manage that themselves. Quite an almost sort of customer thinking focus. This is the product that I will pay for and I'm really happy it's doing good, to thinking a bit more of themselves as investors. If you buy shares, then you don't get a say necessarily in how that organisation then used the money that you've used to get your share, but you've shown some confidence in that organisation. You believe there'll be a longer term payoff for that, and you believe that they'll use those funds wisely and that they have the right idea. And I guess what we're asking for donors and funders of all types to consider is whether or not that's a model they would like to think about adapting, at least for a part of their giving, and thinking about organisations that they trust, they have faith in, and they believe in what they're doing, investing in them as an organisation and letting the organisation look at the areas where they believe they need help and focus, and giving them the funds that would enable them to do that. I'm conscious that I could talk for a long time about the programme, but it would be really lovely to hear some of your thoughts and questions. If there was anything that particularly resonated perhaps, or anything that you wanted to query, how did we get there? Really open to hearing about your thoughts, or perhaps you had some reflections on the challenge at the end. So I'll open the floor to questions. Thanks.